We don't know whether or not China plans to invade Taiwan. We can run a theory where they might, and we can run the theory where they won't. Since we don't know, what we can know is what we can see. What we can see is that China is in a pre-war condition. By pre-war condition, we don't mean that they have decided on war. We mean that they are doing two things that countries do when they get ready. The first is they start conditioning their population politically and rhetorically for the possibility of a conflict and its necessity. The Chinese government has been doing that. The second thing they do is they start raising the readiness and exercise tempo of their forces to widen and deepen the readiness of their forces, which then creates some challenges on the intelligence side because you get more and more signals and it gets more and more difficult to interpret the significance of those. So we do think both of those things are happening, and it's hard to know what they mean, but Bob and I therefore think that we need to take these possibilities very seriously indeed. So when people appreciate a situation in international affairs, they mix together three kinds of judgments. The first is a judgment of value. Do we care about this? The second is a judgment of reality. What's going on? And the third is a judgment about action. What can we do? And these judgments influence each other because you tend not to worry too much about actions for things you don't care about, and so on. Bob has already talked a little bit about the value judgments that go into this crisis, and we've mentioned our careful and worried judgment about the reality of what we can see going on. What I'm going to focus in my part of the presentation are on some of the action judgments. The action, a lot of people can easily debate, do we care about Taiwan? Do we not care about Taiwan? Looking at history, oftentimes the action judgments are the most important variable, yet are often the most dynamic and least well understood. So let's just look at some of the action judgments, starting with the different scenarios by which China might take military action against Taiwan. Let's put up the first slide. So we basically break it down into three different scenarios. In the first scenario, China takes action on Taiwan's periphery, perhaps against, say, offshore islands. Could we move forward and take a look at a map? So when people talk about offshore islands, they mainly talk about, there's an island that's south off this map, deep in the South China Sea, Taiping, which Taiwan claims and to which the Chinese pay some attention. A lot of the recent military exercises and drone flights by the Chinese have focused on this place here, the Pratas Atoll, which, as you can see, is about midway between sort of Hong Kong and the big Chinese bases at Hainan and the Luzon Strait and the Bashi Channel, which are one of the great outlets into the deep Pacific from the South China Sea. Pratas is basically uninhabited except by Taiwan's defenders. Noticing the Chinese attention last year to Pratas, Taiwan rushed hundreds of soldiers and Marines to defend Pratas, who are there now on this atoll out in the ocean. Another possibility would be an attack on populated offshore islands like Penghu, sometimes called the Pescadores, or Kinmen and Matsu, the Quemoy and Matsu islands right off the coast of mainland China. The big question, go back to the first slide before this one. The big question we had about this scenario of China invading Taiwan's periphery is the question of what exactly would China accomplish by doing this? The answer could be, oh, it will terrify Taiwan and intimidate them. Yes, perhaps, but everything China has done so far to try to intimidate Taiwan has actually been counterproductive. It tends to further delegitimize China in Taiwan's politics, make any peaceful reconciliation with China less likely, and it actually weakens the pro-Chinese political parties in Taiwan. So you come back to the question, what will this accomplish? It will frighten Taiwan, but that fear and anxiety may not work in China's benefit, and it will also frighten the rest of the world and basically help create a lot of the things China might want to avoid without actually having addressed the main question. But the Chinese might not see it that way. A second scenario is China could quarantine Taiwan. In this scenario, we don't mean a blockade of food and energy. The quarantine we have in mind is one where they see that the United States is helping Taiwan build up its defenses, and China says, we're not going to tolerate that anymore. So we are simply going to control international access to Taiwan. And we are going to screen incoming shipping, air or sea. And the shipping that we think is suspicious, we will divert for customs clearance on the mainland, air or sea. China in January passed a Coast Guard law that expands the authorities to do just this sort of scenario. In a way, of course, those who are familiar with history will recognize this is a kind of a Cuban Missile Crisis scenario in reverse. The Chinese would be, instead of the Americans saying, we're not going to let you Soviets put these missiles in Cuba, the Chinese were going to be saying, we're not going to let you Americans keep sending Harpoon missiles to Taiwan. And we're going to interdict shipping and screen it. We're not going to interfere with the daily ferries and so on. We'll just check out what we want to check out. So it's a kind of a denial of access strategy. That's a scenario, and then one has to work through the practical responses to that by America or its allies. And in the third scenario, China could, of course, just invade Taiwan. The invasion scenarios tend to have two sub-scenarios, if you will. There is one is a quick decapitation invasion that relies heavily on airborne and heliborne assaults. It relies on special operations forces to quickly decapitate Taiwan's government, to then open up airfields and harbors for the landing of larger Chinese forces. There's the more traditional siege and amphibious assault. The point to make about the invasion scenarios is that intrinsically, from a military point of view, these sorts of assaults are just a very difficult military problem. So the situation for Taiwan is not hopeless. And then people have analyzed Taiwan's defenses, and the usual conclusion is that theoretically, Taiwan might be able to offer a robust defense to these scenarios, at least for a time. But Taiwan has not yet built up its defenses in a way that maximizes the likelihood of realizing that theoretical potential of self-defense. They are not building up, say, the way in Israel or even a Switzerland built up its armed forces. Instead, they have ended conscription and traditionally spent a lot of their money on big ticket items. And we have been counseling for a long time that they should instead pursue things we call asymmetric defense that emphasizes these theoretical possibilities. But a few analysts believe that Taiwan is really there yet, but they could get there, perhaps. Now, let me now turn to the options that the United States has in scenarios like these. Next slide. So we see, Bob and I see four basic approaches. The first approach is the United States should not plan on the direct US defense of Taiwan. This is straightforward. Various academics and others have said, you know what, this is China's sphere of influence, not ours. This is not our vital interests. We should just not plan on the direct US defense, period. And that is not the position Bob and I have taken in our report, but there are people who hold this view. Second approach. In this approach, the United States would not commit in advance to the direct US defense of Taiwan, yet it would plan as if the United States might do that. It would therefore be unclear whether the United States would provide direct defense of Taiwan. It would also be unclear what role Japan or other allies would play in these defensive plans, because those roles are not being rehearsed and so on. Further, it would be unclear about whether the US defense plans involve attacks into the Chinese mainland and open the door to general war with China. This second approach is what we believe is the current status quo policy of the United States. This series of mysteries. We comment on that approach just with this, that anyone analyzing alternative US military strategies for Taiwan, like this status quo approach, are people who are now studying a fog. In that fog, some analysts assert that current defense plans are adequate, though this readiness may not be evident to the public. Others assert that the current strategy is a Potemkin village, wishful assurances from a country that has already displayed this trait so often in recent years, from Iraq to Afghanistan, in pandemics or in Texan winters. On the other hand, reacting to our report, some current and former insiders think our worries are dead right, that if the emperor is not naked, the emperor's garb is at least threadbare. On the other hand, others claim that we're wrong, that we just can't see the clothes the emperor is wearing, nor are we seeing the tailors who are so hard at work in fabricating the garment. Well, this is the challenge of debating war plans and defense preparedness in this environment. Bob and I do not just assume the worst. Instead, humbled by uncertainty and what is at stake, we just are reluctant to trust such mysteries and vague assurances. So then it brings us to an alternative third approach. The third approach is that the United States could commit, plan, and prepare to share responsibility for direct defense of Taiwan, straight up. These scenarios usually assume that the United States would plan on hitting the targets in the Chinese mainland that are involved in the military actions against Taiwan. The only comment one can make about this third option, there are many comments one can make about it, but one comment one can make is that these do have a little bit of a whiff about them of Douglas MacArthur in 1950 and 1951. In these two respects. First, there is a danger of radical underestimation of the Chinese, which MacArthur exhibited in his March to the Yalu, a wishful defense plan, which did not hedge adequately against the dangers. And second, MacArthur in late 50 and early 51 was somewhat casual in his approach to planning for general war against China and the strikes and blockades against the Chinese mainland that he advocated to the president, and which were among the reasons for his eventual dismissal in April of 1951. But this third approach is being seriously advocated by people now in the United States and by members of the US Congress, for instance, in the Taiwan Defense Act that was proposed by Senator Hawley last year. There isn't then a fourth approach that's possible. This is the one that Bob and I advocate. In the fourth approach, in addition to the second status quo approach, the United States would prepare and rehearse a parallel allied plan that could challenge Chinese denial of access and ship defense supplies to Taiwan. Now go to the next slide, because we want to delve a little bit more deeply into this option. When you break down this option, I want to call attention to three aspects that Bob and I think are very important. First, note that in this option, the plan places the burden very clearly on China to widen any war beyond Taiwan. Rather than the United States starting to attack Chinese forces in its efforts to help Taiwan defend itself, and thereby the United States is initiating war against China, in this scenario, the burden would be on China to attack American and we hope allied, above all Japanese forces that are involved in trying to help Taiwan defend itself. Second variable to notice, even if China attacks the United States and Japan near Taiwan, this plan does not assume automatically that such a war should extend to the Chinese mainland. It is not casual in developing a plan that opens the door to general war with China, which is an idea that at the very least needs to be thought through all the way. And that includes, by the way, the parallel actions Russians, North Koreans, and Iranians would take in that scenario. The third variable that we call out is that instead, the United States and its allies should prepare visibly and in advance what they would do politically and economically if there was a limited war. This is quite realistic. We believe if there was a limited war in which Americans and Japanese were being killed in a conflict that China had triggered, we believe that overnight, the United States would break economic relations of all kinds with China, and ideally Japan would do that too if its citizens had been killed. And further, that Japan and the United States would embark on programs of mobilization and remilitarization of a kind that would need to be reckoned with, and which for Japan would be a fundamental historic shift from its position since 1945. Since we believe it is realistic to expect that these things would happen after the outbreak of a limited war, we think it is vital to begin planning for that scenario now, visibly in advance, so that the Chinese leadership can reckon with this possibility as clearly as possible before a crisis occurs in order to deter a war from breaking out at all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You've really laid a lot on the table and beautiful.